The house cost me $350 a month, which in Lafayette would have gotten me a parking space, and the theoretical use of a shared bathroom down the hall. But out here in Catahoula Parish, it got me a two-bedroom Creole cottage on an acre and a half of mixed pine and cypress, overlooking a bayou that didn't appear on any map I could locate online or in the parish library's collection of local surveys. I am an English teacher, not a suspicious person by nature, and I had spent the previous 18 months adjuncting at 3 different community colleges in Baton Rouge while living in an apartment so small that my cat Flannery had to turn sideways to navigate between the bed and the desk. When the full-time position at Thibault Parish Consolidated School opened in late July, I applied within the hour of seeing the listing. When the rental appeared in the same search the following morning, at that price, with those square feet, I took it as a sign from a universe that had been withholding good news for an extended period and had finally gotten around to delivering some. My name is Claire Arsenault, which is a Cajun name, despite the fact that I grew up in Shreveport, with parents who had left the culture so thoroughly behind that I didn't speak a word of French and had never eaten a boudin ball before the age of 22, when a friend from Lafayette introduced me to the concept at a gas station outside of Alexandria, in the way that gas station boudin demands to be introduced with no ceremony and no context, just a paper bag and the instruction to try it. I am 28 years old. I went to LSU for my undergraduate degree and then to Tulane for my master's in English education, which left me with a credential, a thesis on dialect literature in the American South that I was proud of, and that had been read in its entirety by approximately 6 people, and a debt load that explained why I was willing to move to a parish I had never visited for a teaching salary that would have seemed modest in 1987. I am practical organized, the kind of person who color codes her lesson plans and keeps a maintenance log for her car, who reads the whole lease before signing it usually, and who, under ordinary circumstances, would have researched a property thoroughly before committing to a year of habitation. The circumstances were not ordinary in the sense that I had been in Baton Rouge for 18 months, teaching courses I found unrewarding at institutions that didn't have the resources to make them rewarding, and living in a space that had become hostile to my mental health in the specific way that small spaces become hostile when you spend too much time in them. And when the opportunity arose, I moved toward it with more speed than caution. This is the honest account of how I came to be in that house without knowing what I was in. The property manager was a man named Odile Fontenot, which is a woman's name being used as a man's name in the way that Cajun naming tradition sometimes repurposes things, and he was somewhere between 60 and 80 years old, with the extensively weathered quality of a man for whom the entire range of those decades had been spent outdoors, regardless of weather or preference. He met me at the house on a Saturday afternoon in early August, when the heat was the specific Louisiana heat that feels less like weather than like a decision the atmosphere has made about you personally. He walked me through the property with the efficiency of a man who has walked through it many times and has stopped seeing it pointing at rooms rather than entering them, offering information in the abbreviated style of someone who considers unsolicited detail a form of inefficiency. The house was old in the functional rather than the photogenic sense, not the kind of old that gets written up in shelter magazines about Southern architecture, but the kind that accumulates through generations of adequate maintenance and regular patching, where the repairs of different eras are visible in the inconsistency of materials, newer boards alongside old ones, a window frame that didn't quite match the wall around it, floors that sloped gently toward the back of the house as though the structure were engaged in a very slow and extremely patient process of lying down. The kitchen had been updated at some point during the Carter administration, and not since, which produced an avocado and oak character that I found more amusing than concerning. The two bedrooms were functional. The bathroom had a claw-foot tub that was genuinely lovely old porcelain sturdy feet. The kind of thing that gets photographed for real estate listings as a selling point, and a window that looked out over the bayou through a screen held in the frame by what appeared to be a combination of paint and optimism. The only piece of information Odile Fontenot volunteered without my prompting was about the dock. He mentioned it in the middle of showing me the second bedroom without any particular inflection or lead-up, in the way you mention something you consider too obvious to require framing. He said the dock at the back of the property was not for my use. It belonged to the family next door. I was not to tie anything to it, fish from it, or walk on it. I said that seemed entirely reasonable. He nodded with the satisfied air of a man who had said what needed to be said about the dock, and considered the topic closed. The lease was for a full year. I signed it. In retrospect, the speed with which he produced the lease already printed, already organized the signature lines, already flagged with small adhesive arrows, was a thing I noticed and did not think about in any useful way. He was in his car before it occurred to me that he had not asked for the security deposit. I texted him about it that evening. He responded with the amount and his Venmo handle and nothing else, which I found efficient at the time, and which I now understand differently. The Thibault Parish Consolidated School was 22 minutes from the house down a state highway that ran through agricultural land, so flat you could see the tree line marking the next waterway from miles away, the vertical punctuation of cypress and Spanish moss that told you if you knew how to read the landscape, where the water was and had always been. The school served approximately 340 students in grades 6 through 12 and had a faculty of 19, of whom I was the youngest, by at least 8 years, and the only one who had not grown up in the parish or in an adjacent one. This was communicated to me not unkindly, but with the directness of contextual information on my first day by my department chair, Madeleine Trosclair, who I liked immediately and trusted within the week. Madeleine was 53 and had been teaching at Thibault, Consolidated for 27 years, and had the settled authority of a person who has spent a long time doing the right work well. She had strong opinions about the Oxford comma and about the inadvisability of teaching Faulkner before 11th grade, both positions I shared, and our agreement on these matters established between us a collegial warmth that I was grateful for, given that I knew no one else in the parish, and that the house, while sufficient, was generating the specific quality of quiet that is easy to underestimate in the abstract and very difficult to live with in practice. In my second week, she asked where I was renting. I described the property, the Creole cottage, the bayou view, the avocado kitchen, the dock that wasn't mine. She did a thing with her face. It was not a large thing, a brief reorganization of her expression, a fractional pause, a slight repositioning of her attention, but it was unmistakable to a person watching for it, and I was watching for it because I had already begun to develop the habit of watching for it. She changed the subject to the ninth grade reading list, which we had genuine reasons to discuss, and I let her change it, because I was new enough to understand that there were things in this community that would take time to access, and that pushing too directly, too soon, was the reliable way to close doors that might otherwise open. I thought about that pause on her face for the rest of the day and on several occasions afterward. My nearest neighbors were a family named Broussard, which I learned from the mailbox at the end of their driveway, rather than from any introduction, because no introduction was forthcoming. The Broussard property was separated from mine by a stand of live oaks hung with Spanish moss, so thick and so aged that in certain lights the trees appeared to be wearing it rather than growing it, heavy gray curtains that moved in the bayou breeze and reduced the visual connection between the two properties to a series of partial glimpses through deep shade. Through these glimpses, I could occasionally see the roof line of a house that was larger than mine and better maintained, the evidence of a family that had occupied a piece of ground for a long time, visible in the accumulation of things. A kitchen garden in late summer production, several outbuildings in varying states of upkeep, a pirogue turned upside down on sawhorses beside the house, strings of haint bottles on the porch catching the afternoon light in green and blue glints. I saw people on the Broussard property from the beginning. An older woman in the garden in the mornings, moving through the rows with the specific economy of a person who has been doing the same task in the same space for decades and has refined the motion to its essentials. A man of indeterminate middle age who appeared periodically behind the largest outbuilding doing mechanical work I couldn't identify from the distance. Teenage boy who stood at the property line, sometimes not near the fence, not far from it, just at it, looking toward my house with the particular quality of attention that is not curiosity exactly, but something more systematic than curiosity, as though he were tracking something rather than wondering about it. None of them introduced themselves. None of them waved when I waved, and I waved every time I saw them for the first month, because I was raised to believe that you wave at your neighbors regardless of reciprocity, because the reciprocity is not the point. My waving produced no visible response, except on one occasion when the teenage boy, instead of looking away as he usually did, held my gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable before he turned and went back through the oaks. I filed this in the category of rural Louisiana social customs I had not yet learned and tried to maintain a charitable interpretation. In the second week of September, the older woman left a jar of something on my porch, dark and viscous and unlabeled, sealed with a wax-dipped lid in the way that home canning sometimes is. I decided it was fig preserves because the figs in the yard were at their peak, and because the alternative interpretations were uncharitable, and because I had been raised to accept gifts from neighbors in the spirit in which they were offered. I left a thank you note in their mailbox. The following morning, the teenage boy was at the property line earlier than usual, looking at my house, and then he went back through the oaks, and that was the entirety of the interaction. I asked the school secretary, Donna Thibodeau, if she knew the Broussard family. She said everyone in the parish knew the Broussards, that they had been on that stretch of bayou longer than anyone could specifically say. I asked if they were generally unfriendly or if there was a specific reason they didn't interact with me. Donna gave me a version of the face Madeline had given me, the careful reorganization that communicates the presence of something being withheld, and said they were private people, that it was their way, and that I shouldn't take it personally. I said I wasn't taking it personally, which was mostly true. The dock, which I had not used and had no intention of using, was visible from my back porch through the cypress at the property's edge. It was a structure of weathered cypress planking extending into the bayou on the Broussard side of the line, and it showed evidence of regular maintenance in a way that the rest of their property, visually comfortable in its accumulated wear, did not quite match. The planking was sound, the pilings were true, the cleats were rust-free. Someone maintained that dock with specific and consistent attention. Most evenings when I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine and the papers I was perpetually behind on grading the dock was empty in the visual sense. No boats, no people, nothing to account for its presence in my visual field except its structure and the water around it. But sometimes at dusk or shortly after I would hear it. The sound of cypress planking under weight, the specific creak of old wood accepting a load, the corresponding movement of water around the pilings that you hear when something changes the displacement at that point of the surface. I would look up and the dock would be empty. The sound would stop or diminish or move. It was difficult to characterize precisely, and the dock would be as it appeared, which was unoccupied. I told myself it was thermal contraction. Old wood hot days, the structure cooling and adjusting as the temperature dropped in the evenings. This is a real phenomenon. I relied on it as an explanation for several weeks. October arrived and the heat moderated in the partial way that Louisiana heat moderates in October, which means it became theoretically possible to be outside in the middle of the afternoon without it constituting a physical challenge while remaining substantially warmer than any reasonable October should be. The cypress turned amber along the bayou. The Spanish moss went from its summer gray-green to a darker gray with a quality I found almost blue in certain lights. The smell of the wetland in autumn, which is specific and complex and not unpleasant once you have adapted to it, the smell of water and decomposition and things in process became the background note of my days in a way that I had grown to find orienting rather than troubling. My students were by October beginning to trust me with their actual opinions, which is a threshold that takes longer to cross in communities with strong local identity, because the question of whether an outsider deserves access to the real version of things is a reasonable question with a non-obvious answer. I had been making what I thought was genuine progress. My junior English students were reading. Their eyes were watching God with the engagement that the book demands and deserves, and their responses were showing me that they had opinions about Hurston's choices that they were willing to argue for, which is the thing you are actually trying to produce, and which does not happen on a predictable schedule. There was a student named Theo Broussard in my junior English class. I had not connected the name to my neighbors until he was present in my classroom for the third week, when something in the way he held himself at the property line on a Saturday morning, and the way he held himself in his desk in the third row aligned in my perception in a way that I couldn't unalign. The same systematic quality of attention, the same economy of expression. He was not a talkative student, but when he spoke, he said things that were worth saying, and he listened to other students' comments with the attentiveness of someone who is genuinely processing rather than waiting for his turn. He was a good reader. He had specifically good instincts for what a text was doing beneath what it was saying, which is the most useful instinct a reader can have, and one of the harder ones to teach. I became more careful after I made the connection, not to give him any reason to think I was treating him differently because of where he lived. This required more management than I had expected, because I wanted to ask him things that I understood were not appropriate to ask a student, and that would have required him to navigate the boundary between his family and his English class in a way that was unfair to put on a 17-year-old. I restricted my questions in his direction to the texts and the assignments. I was professional about it. This did not prevent him from appearing at the property line on Saturday mornings. The first direct conversation I had with Theo at the fence happened in the third week of October. I was in the yard in the morning, not for any particular purpose, but because the morning was as good as Louisiana mornings get, and the house had been feeling close in a way I was not entirely ready to examine. He was sitting on top of the fence in the fence, straddling posture I had come to associate with him with the particular balance of someone who has sat on that fence since childhood and has no concern about falling. I said good morning. He said good morning. I asked if he was one of the Broussards. He said yes, his name was Theo. I said I was Claire, which he knew. He said he knew. There was a pause that I identified as the kind of pause that contains more than ordinary silence, contains the pause of someone deciding whether to say the thing they came to say. I asked if his family used the dock much. He looked at me for a moment before answering in the evaluative way I had come to recognize, not reluctance exactly, but the careful measurement of what to offer. He said the dock was used, but not exactly by his family. He said the dock had been there as long as the family had been there, and before that, and it had always served the same purpose. He said there were people along the bayou who used the water the way other people use roads who moved along it at night, and that the dock was a stopping point for them. I said I hadn't seen any boats. He said they didn't all come by boat. I waited. He looked at the bayou with the expression of someone consulting something internal before deciding how much of it to share with the person they're talking to. He said Mémère calls them the old ones, les anciens. He used the French phrase and then gave me the English. He said they were in the water before the families came, before the levees, before the roads. He said a lot of families along this stretch had arrangements with them. informal understandings about what the water was and who used it, and what was expected in return for that use going undisturbed. He said the Broussards had maintained their arrangement for as long as anyone in the family could trace. He said the dock was the visible part of the arrangement, the physical accommodation, and that it worked as long as no one interfered with it. I asked what interfering with it would mean. He said going on the dock after dark, shining lights on the water after dark, looking too hard at what was moving there. He said there were also things about the house, things that were part of a different history that he wasn't sure I knew about. I asked him what history. He looked at me with an expression that combined several things I couldn't entirely separate. Something that might have been regret, and something that might have been the specific discomfort of someone who has information they're not sure they should be the one to give. He said there were things that should be told by someone else. He said I should ask Madeline about the property. He said she would know what needed to be known. I said Madeline had changed the subject twice when I'd brought up the house. He said then ask her not to. He got off the fence and went back through the oaks. I stood with the morning air and the bayou light and the increasing conviction that the category of things that are strange but not immediately threatening was not adequately capturing what I was dealing with. That afternoon, the smell was in the front of the house, not just in the back hallway where I had first noticed it in early October, present in the kitchen, present near the front door, the particular quality of it that I had been categorizing as crawlspace must or bayou intrusion, now seeming less like either of those things and more like itself, which I was increasingly unable to describe in terms of anything I had previously smelled. It had an organic quality, yes, but not the organic quality of decay or of active biological process. Something older feeling, something that had been settled in a place for a very long time. I called Odile Fontenot. He answered on the fifth ring and listened to my description with a silence that extended past the duration that a landlord listening to a maintenance concern typically maintains. He said he would look into it. I asked when I might expect to hear back. He said he would be in touch. He did not say when. He did not call back. Over the following 3 weeks, I called him twice more, and each time he said the same thing in approximately the same words, and nothing came of it. I mentioned the smell to Madeleine not because I expected her to know about it, but because I was tired of the face she made when I mentioned the house and wanted to produce a situation where she either explained the face or stopped making it. I mentioned it while we were walking from the parking lot to the building on a Monday morning, which I chose deliberately because it's harder to change the subject while walking than while sitting, and because the walk was long enough that if she didn't engage, I would have time to ask again. She said old houses near the water had all kinds of atmospheric issues, and that it was worth having the place inspected. She said it in the tone of someone providing a reasonable and accurate piece of information. That is not the piece of information the conversation is about. I said, Madeline. You make a face every time I mention where I live. She stopped walking. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a conversation to become direct enough to be having, and is now deciding whether to have it. She said there's a history to that property, Claire. It's the kind of history that people in the parish generally know before they make decisions about it. She said she had assumed I knew. She said most people in my position would have found out before signing a lease. I said I hadn't found out because no one had told me. She said she understood that now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said you should go to the parish library and talk to Coronet Savoy. Ask her to pull the materials on the Landry property. She'll know what you're asking for. I asked what the Landry property was. She looked at me steadily. She said it's what your house was called before it stopped being called anything. She walked into the building and I stood in the parking lot for a moment with the Monday morning sun on my face and the word Landry in my head in the particular way that a word sits when it has just become significant. The parish library was in the town of Thibault, a 15-minute drive from the school. It had been built in the early 1960s and renovated in the late 1990s with that characteristic late 90s renovation aesthetic track, lighting new carpet in a color that had seemed neutral then and seemed dated now, and it served the community with the particular dedication of institutions that understand they are the only option for many of the people who use them. Corinne Savoy, the librarian, was 50-something with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the specific intellectual warmth of a small-town librarian who treats every research question as inherently worth pursuing. I told her I was looking for materials on a property I was renting, which I described by location and general description. I watched her face go through a sequence that ended in professional composure maintained over something more complicated. She said she had some materials that might be relevant. She said she would get them. She brought me to a table near the back of the building and produced a manila folder and a thin spiral-bound document with a paper cover that said Catahoula Parish Historical Landmarks and Properties of Note, a Community History Project, 1983. She set them in front of me and said to take my time, that she would be at the desk if I had questions. She left me with them and returned to her work. I sat with the folder in front of me for longer than was strictly necessary. Then I opened it. The folder contained photocopied newspaper clippings in chronological order, with handwritten dates on yellow post-it notes marking each section. Someone had organized this folder with care and had been adding to it over a long period of time. The oldest post-it notes were faded and brittle, and the newest were still bright yellow. It was the folder of a subject that the community kept returning to without quite resolving. The earliest clippings were from the Thibault Courier-Dispatch, the parish paper from November and December of 1938. The Courier-Dispatch wrote in the compressed, carefully neutral style of rural newspapers of that period, a style that communicates the effort required to maintain neutrality on subjects the community is not comfortable with, every word in place, every sentence grammatically impeccable, the emotional weight of what is being described present only in the accumulated restraint of what is not said. The Landry family had occupied the property since at least the early decades of the century. Possibly earlier, the paper was not precise about this, in ways that suggested the imprecision was a choice. They were a fishing family, one of many, along that stretch of bayou, who had organized their lives around the water, who had built their modest prosperity from it, and had not felt any particular urgency to diversify. The father and mother, Emile and Clotilde Landry, had raised 4 children who had mostly stayed 3 sons, who had established their own households on or adjacent to the family property, 1 daughter who had married into another Bayou family 10 miles north. At the time of the incident, as the Courier Dispatch consistently referred to it, the family group living on and around the Landry property included Emile and Clotilde, their 3 sons with their wives and 6 grandchildren, ranging from 3 years old to 14. 13 people in total. On the night of November 8, 1938, all 13 of them died. The paper reported this in a single column on the front page, which, for the Thibault Courier Dispatch in 1938, was not a small allocation of space, and with a specificity of detail that suggested the editor had wrestled with how much to include. The bodies had been found by a neighbor. The clipping did not name the neighbor, which was a notable omission early in the morning of November 9th. Most of the family had been found in and around the bayou behind the main house. The cause of death in 8 of the 13 cases was listed as drowning. In the remaining 5 cases, the coroner's report listed the cause as undetermined. There had been no storm. The bayou had not flooded. The weather on the night of the 8th had been, according to the paper, clear and cold, the kind of night that comes to Louisiana in November, when a front has moved through and the air has temporarily resolved into something honest. The positioning of the bodies, which the paper mentioned briefly and then declined to elaborate on, had been described in the coroner's report, which I found in a subsequent clipping, a partial reproduction from what appeared to be a later reporting on the investigation as arranged. The word was used in the coroner's report, and the paper reproduced it without comment, which is its own kind of comment. 13 people arranged in and around the bayou in positions that the coroner characterized as not consistent with accidental drowning and not consistent with any natural dispersal pattern he could identify. The investigation produced nothing useful. The clippings from December of 1938 and into the spring of 1939 documented the systematic failure of the investigation to arrive at any conclusion that the official processes of a Louisiana parish in the late 1930s were equipped to arrive at. Tire tracks in the mud near the property's road entrance could not be matched to a specific vehicle. Physical evidence was present but uninterpretable in the framework available to the investigators. No motive could be established. No witnesses came forward. The investigation closed without resolution in the spring of 1939. The property was sold to satisfy estate debts, as there were no immediate heirs willing to take possession. The daughter who had married north declined in terms that were documented in a subsequent legal filing, but not explained, and the more distant relatives who were contacted showed a consistent reluctance that the filings noted without characterizing. The property changed hands twice in the 1940s and 3 times in the 1950s, and was apparently difficult to rent or sell, which the 1983 Community History Project addressed in a single paragraph of careful language that said the property had a troubled history and noted that it was considered by many local residents to be unsuitable for habitation without explaining what unsuitable meant in this context. The last item in the folder was not a newspaper clipping or a historical document. It was a handwritten note on half a sheet of yellow legal pad, undated but aged enough that the paper had gone brittle at the edges. The handwriting was small and even. It said the neighbor that found them was Broussard. The Broussards knew what the water wanted that night, and they didn't warn the Landrys. Some say they couldn't. Some say they chose not to. Either way, the Landrys didn't know, and now they're in the water with the rest. There was no indication of who had written the note, when or why it had been placed in the folder. I sat with the folder closed on the table in front of me for a while before I went to find Corinne. She was at her desk and she was waiting in the way that a person waits when they know the person they're waiting for is going to come back with questions and they have been thinking about how to answer them. She looked up when I approached without the performance of surprise. I asked her how long the folder had been in the collection. She said as long as she had been working there, which was 22 years and longer, before that based on the age of the materials. I asked if many people looked at it. She said occasionally. She said usually people who had some connection to the property, or who had heard about the Landrys from someone local and wanted to understand what they'd heard. I said people know about this, people who live in the parish. She said yes. She said it was one of those things that was part of local knowledge, the way certain things are part of local knowledge in small communities, not discussed openly, not documented in ways that outsiders would easily find, but known, passed through families, understood as context for decisions about certain properties and certain stretches of water. I said Madeleine knew. Donna at the front desk knew. Odile Fontenot obviously knew. Theo Broussard knew. She said she believed that was probably accurate. I said, and no one thought to tell me before I signed a year's lease. She looked at me with an expression that had in it several things that I could identify and one or two that I couldn't. She said, Claire, this is a small parish. The property isn't a secret. The Landrys aren't a secret. People who move here, people who choose a specific property in a specific location, there's an assumption that they've done their research, that they know what they're taking on. She paused. It's not a polite assumption necessarily, but it's the assumption people make. I said I didn't know anything. She said I understand that now. She said it in the tone of a woman who genuinely meant it and who was also not entirely surprised, and those two things coexisted in her voice without apparent contradiction. I drove home from the library in the specific state of frightened, that is cold and organizational rather than hot and disorienting, the kind that makes you grip the wheel correctly and observe the speed limit and think in straight lines. I thought about the dark rings in the clawfoot tub. I thought about the smell that had moved from the back hallway to the front rooms. I thought about the unlocked back door on 2 separate mornings. I thought about the dock sounds nightly, now the creak and the water movement and the nothing when I looked. I thought about Theo saying the dock is not the part you should be worried about, which I had been turning over in my head since October without being ready to examine what it meant. I thought about 13 people arranged in and around a bayou in November 1938, in positions not consistent with accidental drowning. I thought about the neighbor who found them. I thought about what the note in the folder said about that neighbor. I thought about the old woman in the garden and the haint bottles on the porch and the very well-maintained dock and the arrangement that Theo had described with the particular flatness of received information, the flatness of something you have been taught to state as fact rather than opinion, because it is the kind of fact that opinions do not improve. It was dusk when I pulled into the driveway. Through the oak canopy, the bayou caught the last horizontal light in the way it does in November, amber and very still in a way that the bayou technically isn't, because it is always moving, but the light flattens it into the appearance of stillness, and the appearance is convincing enough to hold you for a moment. The back door was unlocked. I stood in the doorway without going in. The kitchen was in its late evening state, the avocado appliances and gold-flecked counters in the particular flatness of a room that gets its character from the life in it and does not have enough life in it to look like anything. The smell was there, not faint, not the background presence I had been tolerating and explaining and cataloging. Present in the way that something is present when it has decided to stop being discreet about its presence. From the back of the house, from the direction of the bathroom, I heard the sound of water running into the clawfoot tub. I had not turned on any tap. There was no one else in the house. The sound was clear and specific and continued for long enough that I stood in the doorway counting seconds while I tried to identify an explanation that did not require me to know what I now knew from the folder in the library. I counted to 37 before I stopped counting and made the decision I had been building toward for several weeks, without being ready to acknowledge I was building toward it. I picked up Flannery in her carrier from the kitchen counter where she spent her evenings. I picked up my laptop and my school bag. I did not go into the back hallway. I did not check the bathroom. I went back out the door I had come in, pulled it closed behind me, and got in my car. I called my colleague Sandra Bro, who lived 20 minutes toward town and who had the practical warmth of a person who does not make other people's crises into dramatic occasions, and told her I needed somewhere to stay for a couple of nights, and could she be home when I arrived. She said of course and asked if I was all right. And I said I was all right in the functional sense of being unhurt and mobile and able to drive. She said that was enough for tonight and she would put on the kettle. I told Sandra everything that evening at her kitchen table over tea that became wine at some point around 10 o'clock. She listened with the careful attention of someone who is taking something seriously without performing the taking seriously, which is the way you want to be listened to when the thing you're describing has enough unusual elements that the listener has to decide to believe you rather than doing it automatically. When I finished, she was quiet for long enough that I could hear the refrigerator and the television on low in the next room and the October night outside the window. She said the Landry place. I said yes. She said I knew you were renting out that way. I didn't know it was that specific property. I asked how she knew about it. She said she had grown up in the parish and the Landrys were part of what you grew up, knowing, one of those local things that existed in the background of childhood without being explained, and that you absorbed through proximity to people who knew, without asking why they knew it. She said it the way people say things they were told so early that the telling and the knowing had become indistinguishable. I asked what specifically she had grown up knowing. She thought about how to answer this in a way that I could see her thinking about it, the arrangement of information in a form that would be communicable to someone without the same context. She said the families along that stretch of bayou, going back as far as anyone could trace it, had understood that the water there was not ordinary water in the sense that water is usually meant. She said there were things that moved in it that were not fish and not other animals that had been there longer than the families had been there, and that the families which had survived and stayed had found accommodations with these things over time. She said the accommodations were not written down and not talked about openly, but were maintained through practice and through the transmission of understanding between generations. She said the Landrys had been one of those families until they weren't. I asked what happened to make them not anymore. She said she didn't know the specific details, that it was one of those pieces of local knowledge that was communicated in its general shape rather than its particulars, because the particulars were not comfortable, and because the lesson, which was about the importance of maintaining the accommodation, was deliverable without them. She said the general shape of what she knew was that the Landrys had done something that violated what the water wanted, and that the water had responded in the way that it responded when violated, and that the responding had been comprehensive. I said, and no one told me any of this. She looked at me across the table with the face that I had seen on Madeleine and on Corinne and on Theo Broussard in different configurations, the face of someone in possession of more than they have been saying about a thing that has been available to be said for several months. She said, "Claire, everyone figured you knew. That's the honest answer. In a place this size with the property that everyone knows, you assume that someone coming in to rent it has done their research. You assume the property manager disclosed what needed to be disclosed." She paused and looked at her wine glass. "You assume people know what they're moving into when they move into a place with a history." I said Fontenot did not disclose anything. She said no, he wouldn't. She said this without elaboration, but with a tone that communicated that Odile Fontenot's approach to disclosure was known, and that its knowingness was itself part of a pattern she could describe if pressed, but would prefer not to. I said so, everyone knew, and no one said anything, and I've been living there for 3 months. She said, "I know." She said it with the specific weight of genuine acknowledgement, the weight of a person who means what the words actually mean, and is not hedging it or framing it or making it comfortable. I know. She knew. She was telling me she knew, and that it was not enough, and that she understood it was not enough, and that the not enoughness was real and was hers to sit with along with mine. We finished the wine. She showed me to the guest room. I lay awake for a while listening to the sounds of a house that was not mine, and that had no back porch and no dock, and no smell in the hallway, and the specific quality of that absence was its own kind of information about what I had been living with for 3 months without fully registering it. I broke the lease on a Thursday. I called Odile Fontenot from Sandra's kitchen in the morning and told him I was terminating the tenancy. He said the lease terms provided for a penalty and I would forfeit the deposit. I said that was fine. He said he was sorry it hadn't worked out. He said it in the tone of a man saying something he has said before, and that has become a formula through repetition. I said goodbye and disconnected. I went to the house with Sandra on a Saturday morning in late November to collect my things. It was a clear, cold morning, the front that had come through 2 days earlier, having resolved the air into an honest November state that Louisiana rarely offers, and the house looked smaller in that light than it had all fall, just an old structure with a soft floor and an avocado kitchen and a clawfoot tub and a back porch that looked out over a bayou that didn't appear on any map I could find. The smell was not present that morning. The back door was locked. The tub was empty and clean and leaving no rings. The dock was visually empty, the bayou around it. Still the cypress trees doing their November morning thing, which was to be beautiful in a way that didn't account for what I now knew about what use the water they stood in. Sandra waited in the car with Flannery while I went through the rooms. I was efficient. The study first, the bedroom second, the kitchen third. I did not examine the tub. I did not go onto the back porch. I moved through the house with the specific efficiency of someone closing a chapter they are not interested in extending. As I carried the last box to the car, I saw the older Broussard woman standing at the edge of the oak stand at the approximate location where the property line ran between the trees. She was watching me load the car with an expression I could not read from the distance except to understand that she was not surprised by what she was watching. I set the box down. I crossed the yard and stopped at the tree line. I said you were the neighbor that found them. Your family. She looked at me for a moment. She said her grandmother's family. She said her grandmother had been 12 years old. I said, why didn't anyone tell me about the Landrys before I moved in? She looked at the house. She looked at the bayou briefly, the look of a person who has been looking at the same water their whole life and has long since resolved the feelings it produces into something they carry without comment. She looked back at me. She said in the flat and certain tone of someone stating something they believe to have been completely obvious, "We thought you knew, Cher." She turned and walked back through the oaks, and the Spanish moss closed behind her like a curtain, and that was the end of it. I found an apartment in Tebow the following week, a two-bedroom on the second floor of a building from the 1970s with no particular character and no bayou view, and a landlord who had asked for the security deposit at the time of signing and had provided a standard disclosure document and had been in every respect an ordinary and unremarkable property manager. The apartment was fine. It had a shower with consistent water pressure and a bathroom that smelled only of the cleaning products I used on it, and floors that were level and a door that locked and stayed locked. The school year continued and became in the way of school years, when the initial adjustment period has resolved genuinely absorbing. My junior English students finished, their eyes were watching God, and moved into a unit on contemporary Southern fiction that generated the kind of arguments I had gone into teaching hoping to generate. The interdisciplinary project with Madeleine's history classes was by the spring semester the best sustained piece of teaching I had done. Madeleine and I had lunch together on Thursdays. Sandra and I had dinner on the occasional Friday. I was building something in Thibault Parish that was worth building, which had been the point of going there, and I was building it from an apartment with level floors and consistent water pressure and no particular history. Theo Broussard remained in my junior English class through the spring semester. He was by spring one of the stronger students in the class. Not the most talkative, never the most talkative, but the one whose contributions tended to reframe the discussion in ways that were worth reframing. He had the instinct for subtext that good literary analysis requires, and that is difficult to teach in students who don't already have it. I wrote a recommendation letter for him in April for a summer program at Tulane, and I meant every word of it. We never discussed the property line conversations. We never discussed the dock or the water or the old ones or what his mémère called them in her French that I had never been able to place in any academic source. He was my student and I was his teacher, and we maintained those roles with a professionalism that served both of us. And that was, I think, the correct approach to a situation that neither of us had created, and that both of us were navigating as well as we could. On the last day of the spring semester, he stopped in the doorway of my classroom after the other students had left. He said he hoped the apartment was working out. I said it was working out well. He nodded with the satisfied quality of someone who has verified something they were concerned about. He started to leave and then turned back and said the thing about the house. The Landrys. He paused. People should have said something. He said it with the particular flatness of received information delivered against itself, the same tone he used for the things he had been taught, used now to contradict what the teaching had allowed to happen. He said Mémère says the water doesn't distinguish between people who know and people who don't. He said she should have made sure you knew. He left. I sat in my empty classroom for a while with the weight of what passed for an apology in a culture where the things that needed apologizing for were too old and too embedded to be addressed directly, and I decided it was enough. It was not sufficient. But it was what was available, and it was genuine, and in the economy of what this situation could offer that counted for something. The house is still available for rent. I know this because the listing refreshed in the spring with updated photographs that showed the clawfoot tub to good advantage and described the bayou view as peaceful and the location as private, both of which are accurate in the ways that accurate things can be accurate without being complete. $350 a month. 2 bedrooms. The dock is not mentioned. The Broussard property is visible in the background of one of the listing photographs through the oaks, the roofline, and one corner of the porch. You can see if you look closely at the photograph, the string of haint bottles catching the light. You would have to know what you were looking at to understand what they were there for. Most people who see the listing will not know what they are looking at. I assume they will find out eventually. I assume by then everyone around them will have assumed they already knew.